Today, we become legends.
From Old War and her elemental crystals back in 2013 to New War and her piece of shit unavoidable ultimate in 2022, this is why I liked Old War better than New War in Smite. If you want to see more Smite history and release gods, hit that sub button and help us on the road to 100k, we'd love to have you aboard. But without further ado, let's jump in with Old War, aka New War's original kit from before her rework in 2014. Yes, 2014, so most likely only 15% of you watching were around to play with Old War. Well, I was, and I can tell you it's a pretty damn fun kit. So Old War's kit does resemble her new one in a lot of ways, but also played very differently. It wasn't a complete rework, more of a partial rework. Her passive was elemental crystals. When she casts an ability, that ability's respective crystal would become active. The wood crystal is the one tied to the passive and is permanently active, giving 10 HP 5. Old War's 1 was still the fog she has now, but it did work slightly differently. Instead of sending out the fog in a direction like you do now, the fog followed New War at 95% of her own movement speed. The fog also didn't do the initial burst it does now, it just did tick damage. However, you could argue that was made up for slightly by the fog following her so she can more reliably get the ticks off. The fog also activates the water crystal from the passive on cast, giving up to 30% movement speed, and each ability crystal buff lasts 10 seconds, aside from that one on the passive, which I mentioned, which is always active. The clay soldiers are the final ability that was the same in her old design, but again, these work slightly differently. Firstly, she could spawn up to 5 minions instead of 3 max like now, and the minions were also, let's say they had a few screws loose up there back in the day. The AI was not good, and these minions would often run off to do something completely different to what you intended. This wasn't helped by the lack of a targeter that the ability has now in her rework to command the minions to attack a certain target. They also didn't have the dash attack they do now that shreds magical procs. They were pretty much a primitive version of what she has now. This also activates the Earth Crystal, giving New War up to 30 physical procs for 10 seconds. So moving on to her 3 and ult, this is where things get very interesting and different from her current design. Starting with the 3, this was not the line stun we now know and did not have the explode clay soldiers mechanic that she now has. That said, I really liked the design of this ability and Old War in general, as you probably gathered by now. Flame Strike was a circular AoE the size of Chronos one that dealt damage and stuns enemies and structures for 1 second and applies a burn that deals more damage over 2 seconds. Yep, you heard me right, this was an ability that was specifically designed to be able to hit towers as well as players. The damage on the ability would increase by up to 50% depending on how close she casts it to herself, closer meaning more damage, and the fire crystal that activates on cast makes your basic attacks deal splash damage in a pretty large range around them, dealing 50% of the damage to nearby enemies. This splash damage also applied on-hit item effects, so you could deal AoE damage with Telkine's Ring and proc it on all enemies in range. And finally, Old War's ultimate might be the one you know of specifically because it was repurposed as Ganesh's ultimate. New War summons the Pillars of Heaven to create a square enclosure with electric walls that deal damage and slow enemies that walk over them, yada yada, you've seen Ganesha ult before. There are 2 noteworthy differences with this ability though versus Ganesha. The first is of course the crystal bonus, which literally doubles your basic attack damage. This one is of course stronger than the others because you need to ult to get the buff, but it does last 10 seconds, which is longer than most if not all steroids of similar caliber in the game nowadays. This also combined really nice with her 3 since the fire crystals makes your autos AoE, so you have 15 foot radius AoE auto attacks that proc item effects in that AoE and deal double damage. Hopefully you can now start to see how this kit was a lot of fun to use and felt very cohesive. As you can probably see now, Old War was somewhat hybrid with the way she played, doing decent ability damage, especially with the 3 and ult, but also having really strong basic attack synergies as well, with the potential to hit towers with your 3 and remove backdoor protections from towers using her soldiers. Pets no longer remove backdoor protections, but they did back when New War originally released, making her a pretty damn effective split pusher. And how could I do an Old War video and not mention the Shake and Bake combo of 2013? Perhaps the most broken interaction in all of Smite, as it literally insta-kills you no matter how much health or how many protections you have. The combo is as simple as put down New War's ult, grab someone with Fenrir, take them to the walls and just spam your camera around to bring them repeatedly in and out of the energy field of Old War's ultimate. Since the enemy takes damage every time they cross the field, they just take like 20 ticks of damage in 1 second and explode. This was vastly most common with Fenrir, but was also known to work on Loki ult and Arachne's old suck ability where she jumps on your head if anyone remembers that. This was fixed extremely quickly, within 6 days according to the Smite wiki, and before anyone gets any ideas, no it doesn't work with Ganesha's ult now. The mechanics of the ability are entirely different. Ganesha's walls just do tick damage every half second to people stood in them. New War's dealt damage whenever you cross the boundary. It's a completely different mechanic. However, it is worth noting that Skadi's Ice could do the same thing until it got patched. I guess hold habits die hard. But sadly, Old War didn't last long. On August 5th, 2014, only 7 months after Old War's original release, New War was born. I won't spend much time explaining her reworked kit since that's just new art in Smite right now, but the old 3, passive and ult, were scrapped, while the 1 and 2 were redesigned slightly and kept. While I do like the changes made to Fog and Clay Soldiers, I do sometimes wish Old War's kit could be brought back in some reworked form. In my view, they removed the 3 most interesting abilities, the passive, the 3, and ult. And by the passive I mean the crystal system, not just the passive. And they kept the most boring 2, Fog and Soldiers, for the rework. A remix of her old kit without the Fog and Soldiers, because of course New War has those now, but on a new god could be really interesting and cool. Perhaps even lean into the magical ADC component of it. It's been a long time since Ola run and we've had plenty of standard burst mages. Maybe it's time for another magical ADC, and just maybe it could take inspiration from this old Smite design. But that's it from me for this one. Let me know if you enjoyed this more in-depth look at a specific rework and my opinions on it. I talk about reworks a lot, but often as a group and in less detail, so if this one goes down well, I could make more of these on other reworks I have strong feelings about. But that's all I got. Don't forget to drop a like before you leave, and have a great day.